Hi, and welcome to Geek Cross, the podcast where faith and culture intersect. I'm your host, Jeremy Yoder, and on each episode of Geek Cross, we're going to look at a topic that's related to pop culture or geekdom, and we will use science fiction or fantasy, movies, comics, video games as a jumping off point to talk about some of the deeper questions and the deeper issues of life. Questions such as, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean for us to live in relationship with other people? And how do we deal with challenges and conflict in our lives? Now, in terms of disclosure, I am an ordained minister. I am a pastor in the Mennonite Church. And so I do bring a certain perspective to this podcast. But I'm not interested in propaganda. I'm not interested in shoving religion down anybody's throat. I'm interested in conversation. So I would love to have conversation on these kinds of topics with those of you out there who aren't Christian or even religious. If you love geek stuff, if you love science fiction and fantasy, and you think and write about what these might mean, please shoot us an email at geekcross@gmail.com. One of the things that inspired me to start this podcast was the fact that I keep running into theologically minded people. That means people who care about theology, who are also huge nerds. Actually, to be perfectly honest, I am one of those people. I discovered Star Trek in the 3rd grade, and it was love at first sight, and I've watched a lot of Next Generation growing up, much to the chagrin of my parents. In the 5th grade, I discovered the Doctor Who novelizations that had come out in the 80s of the classic episode, and I read all the copies the school library had. So I've always considered myself a geek, but not a hardcore geek. I've never dressed up as a character and gone to a con. However, that might be changing. In the past year, I have been on this journey where I have embraced my inner geek with a new vengeance. And I embraced this because being in ministry is often very challenging and stressful. And I realized that I needed some space to do something that wasn't church and that wasn't ministry. That gave me some space to relax and a little bit of self-care. And so this podcast has come out of my desire, my need, to combine passions, to talk about geek stuff and science fiction and fantasy and theology and philosophy. I want to have interesting conversations with interesting people on interesting topics. Of course, there are times like this episode where I don't have a guest. And so it's just me, gentle listener, and a microphone. And so I will offer some of my thoughts on a particular topic, but feel free to engage. Feel free to send me an email. In case you're wondering, I have to confess, I have used Star Trek and Indiana Jones as sermon illustrations, and no, that probably was not a good idea. So here I have this podcast, a place to talk about these things. Now on this particular episode, this premiere episode of Geek Cross, I wanted to talk about stories. And this seems like an appropriate topic for a first episode. After all, a lot of stories out there start with once upon a time. You know, the Bible, the Genesis, starts out with in the beginning. So where do we start? Well, the question I want to ask as we start is, why do we tell stories? Why do we feel passionate about stories? Why does storytelling matter? So one of the things that I've observed is that when we consume media, all right, when we read books, watch movies, play video games, read comics, we're listening to stories. We're participating with stories. And some of those stories become incredibly important to us. They become a part of who we are. And so in fandom, fans often take this next step. And they try to participate with these stories in a very real way. Now, one way that fans participate is by buying more merchandise, buying more stuff. But the more interesting thing is when fans begin to create their own material. When they write fan fiction, when they make fan films, when they cosplay, when they dress up as characters. We want to participate. We want to be a part of the fictional worlds. And so because of our participation, because our love for these franchises, for this material, we often end up having a sense of ownership about it. So for example, the complicated, often antagonistic relationship between George Lucas and Star Wars fans is well documented. There's a documentary on Netflix that I watched the other day called The People versus George Lucas. And it describes the conflict between Lucas, who has this tendency to not leave well alone and tinker with his creation in ways that piss off the fans, who feel this sense of ownership about Star Wars, and who often feel betrayed by Lucas's decisions. I remember the disappointment about the prequels. I remember when Phantom Menace came out. I was in college at the time, and we went to the midnight showing, and, waiting in line was electric. Going into the theater was fantastic. The room was just filled with energy. And then the Star Wars logo came on, and John Williams' music started blasting, and the scroll came up, and the entire room goes crazy and erupts. And then the movie starts. And all of a sudden, we're talking Trade Federation. And then Jar Jar shows up, and I just remember this feeling of deflation, of, oh, no. Oh, no. We were looking for this mythic experience, and for some of us to connect with our childhoods. And what we received were fake, boring, interstellar politics and Jar Jar Binks. It really felt like Lucas had betrayed us. And so, at least emotionally, I don't think Lucas owned Star Wars anymore. I mean, now he literally doesn't own Star Wars now that he sold it to Disney. But before that, emotionally, I think the fans had a stake in it. They had a sense of ownership in what happened to these characters and what happened in these stories. And so there are times when I read the kinds of fights that break out over the internet, on Twitter, and they remind me, honestly, of the fights that we have in church about theology and scripture. The stakes are really high sometimes. We really care about these things, and we get really upset if somebody starts messing around with it. Now, as a pastor, I might get into trouble for saying this, but it appears to me that there are parallels between fandom and geekdom with religious experience and identity. Now, I don't mean to overstate my case. I got in trouble with a seminary prof who didn't appreciate when I compared Christian discipleship with guys who dressed up as Klingons or stormtroopers. But he had a point. On the one hand, my comparison treated religion and faith as just another consumable, just another media option for us to buy. That religion is just another form of entertainment, and that you could simply just choose to walk away from it if it no longer met our needs. Of course, in Western culture, in North America, we do treat religion as just another consumable. But that's a problem of late capitalism's tendency to commodify and to sell back us everything we hold sacred. And yet, on the other hand, when fans talk about what Star Wars or Star Trek means to them, there's something deeper there. Something that's more than just simple entertainment. Something that has to do with identity. Perhaps something, maybe we could use the word spiritual. The language that we use to talk about geekdom sometimes has religious overtones. For example, the word canon. Canon is the material, the stories that are part of the official fictional universe. It's also a word that has religious meaning, religious dimension to it. The very first canon in Western culture is the biblical canon. The books that are considered to be, by the Christian church, to be authoritative. There's also this thing called canon law, which are the rules and the regulations that are adopted by an ecclesiastical body, like the Catholic or the Eastern Orthodox churches. So, in other words, canon and fandom are the stories that carry authority in the fictional universe. Canon in religion are scriptures and practices that carry authority in the faith community. People feel passionate about geekdom just as they feel passionate about the Bible. Because geekdom, like theology, like religious belief, is personal. What is it then about stories, whether they are secular or sacred, holy or profane, that attract our passions? What is it about them that grounds us, that gives us meaning and identity? Now, I think there are two basic reasons. The first reason is that stories give us identity. The second reason is that stories teach us how to overcome difficulty. Now, there is a Star Trek Next Generation episode, and I have to give the spoiler alarm here, called Birthright. It was a 2-part episode from the 6th season of Star Trek: The Next Generation. In this story, Worf discovers Klingons at a Romulan prison compound. And these Romulans captured Klingons years earlier during a Khitomer massacre. And so after the war between the Klingon and the Romulan empires ended, these Klingons choose not to return home in order to protect their family's honor. In warlike Klingon culture, death in battle is honorable. Capture, however, is dishonorable and shameful. So it is more honorable for these Klingons to remain in exile, to remain in captivity, rather than to notify their families that they survived as prisoners of war. Now, over the years, these Klingons and their Romulan guards lived peacefully together and even intermarried. And so now there is a generation of young Klingons, young acculturated Klingons, who don't know who they are, who don't really know what it means to be a Klingon. They don't know Klingon culture. They don't know the Klingon way of life. They're lost. And so when Worf comes to the compound, when he discovers this community, he challenges the fragile peace because he begins to teach and to inspire these young Klingons about what it means to be a Klingon. Now, of course, this is ironic. Worf grew up as a foster child in a human family because his father was killed at Khitomer. Throughout Star Trek, Worf often struggles to understand his place in Klingon culture, and he's not always accepted by the other Klingons. But here, Worf is the teacher. Worf is the communicator of Klingon culture and values, and he begins to tell these young Klingons their stories, and he teaches them their songs, and then he creates unrest. At one point, a young Klingon named Tok stands up and says, quote, "Today I discovered that warrior's blood runs through my veins. I do not know how or why, but we have forgotten ourselves. Our stories are not told, our songs are not sung. Tonight, as we came home, we sang a song of victory, a song known only to me as a lullaby, but it is a warrior's song." Unquote. Stories tell us who we are. They teach us the values of our culture. They teach us what our place in the world is. We see a similar dynamic in the Bible, in Scripture. The book of Deuteronomy is best known as being a law book, a rule book. But in chapter 6, it has a really interesting passage. In verses 4 through 8, the voice of God tells Israel to bind the law to their bodies. He says, quote, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. Keep these words that I am commanding you today in your heart. Recite them to your children and talk about them when you are at home and when you are away, when you lie down and when you rise. Bind them as a sign on your hand, fix them as an emblem on your forehead, and write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates." Unquote. Why does God command Israel, the people of God, to bind the law to their bodies and to their homes? A couple of reasons. The first reason is so that they remember who they are, that they know that they're the people of God. And the second reason is that they can teach this identity to their children. A few verses later in chapter 6, these commands are then connected to the Exodus story of God leading the Hebrews out of slavery in Egypt. Quote, "When your children ask you in time to come, what is the meaning of this decree and the statutes and the ordinances that the Lord our God has commanded you, then you shall say to your children, we were Pharaoh's slave in Egypt, but the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand." Unquote. Now, this is something that we in the West don't really understand very well. We look at the Bible and we say it's a book of rules. Some people say it is a manual for life. And what we leave out is that there's a relationship here. That Israel, the people of God, follow these rules, follow these laws, because they had a relationship with God, and out of remembering, out of gratefulness of what God had done for them when God delivered them out of Egypt, out of slavery. The law is part of their identity. It is the center of their existence. It is the center of who they are, and is connected with this foundational story of deliverance and freedom. One of the stories that my family tells about my grandmother is that when my aunts and uncles were growing up and they would leave the house, they would go out for the night, my grandmother would always say, "Verges net wer du bist." Now, I apologize for my poor Pennsylvania Dutch, but what that means is don't forget who you are. Now, part of that was to remind my aunts and uncles to not do anything that would bring shame upon the family. Don't forget what family you are. But it's also an encouragement to remember that when we go out into the world, that we take our histories with us. We take our identity with us. And part of the challenge of life is to remember who we are. Stories help us to remind us at times of challenge and difficulty who we truly are. Now, the second reason why I think we tell stories has to do with the fact that stories show us, teach us, how to overcome the challenges of life. This is particularly true for fairy tale. There is an essay by G.K. Chesterton called The Red Angel. Now, Chesterton was an author, essayist, Christian apologist, and cultural critic. He's often referred to as the Prince of Paradox. And in an essay published in 1909 in a book called Tremendous Trifles, Chesterton defends telling fairy tales to children. He begins the essay by saying that a lady had written to him that it was cruel to tell fairy tales to children because they are scary stories that frighten them. And Chesterton responds that this is misplaced concern. That this woman who's written this letter has forgotten that children will make up monsters anyway. Quote, "If you keep bogies and goblins away from children, they would make them up for themselves. One small child in the dark can invent more hells than Swedenborg." Unquote. Just a quick note. Emanuel Swedenborg, who lived from 1688 to 1772, was a Swedish scientist and theologian who's best known for his book, Heaven and Its Wonders and Hell from Things Heard and Seen. It's a book that described the afterlife, and it was incredibly influential in the 19th century. Edgar Allan Poe cites it in one of his stories. Chesterton continues, quote, "One small child can imagine monsters too big and black to get into any picture, and give them names too unearthly and cacophonous to have occurred in the cries of any lunatic. The child, to begin with, commonly likes horrors, and he continues to indulge in them even when he does not like them. The fear does not come from the fairy tales. The fear comes from the universe of the soul." Unquote. What Chesterton is basically saying is that there's something innate in us, what he calls the universe of the soul, that is both attracted and horrified by the things that go bump in the night. Fairy tales and other scary or macabre stories are an expression of innate, universal fear of the unknown. Therefore, Chesterton argues, fairy tales are not responsible for causing fear in children because the children are already afraid. And no matter how well-intentioned, it is impossible to shield children from the terrors of the world because the world is already filled with terrors. The value of fairy tales, according to Chesterton, is that they teach children that these limitless terrors have a limit. Quote, "Fairy tales, then, are not responsible for producing in children fear, or any of the shapes of fear. Fairy tales do not give the child the idea of evil or the ugly. That is in the child already, because it is in the world already. Fairy tales do not give the child his first idea of bogey. What fairy tales give the child is his first clear idea of the possible defeat of bogey. The baby has known the dragon intimately ever since he had imagination. What the fairy tale provides for him is a St. George to kill the dragon."
I often come back to the Red Angel when responding to more conservative friends and relatives who object to horror, especially since they believe that scary stories promote evil. But I think we need horror, we need science fiction, we need fantasy, we need storytelling as a way of understanding how our world works and our place in it. We need stories. We need stories because life is hard, because life has challenges, because we often struggle. We need stories because winter is coming and the nights are long. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Geek Cross, and I look forward to more conversations. Special thanks this episode to Aileen Sims for her advice on how to start a podcast. Tech support by Zeph McLaren. Come find us on the internet at geekcrossshow@gmail.com, and you can also find us on Twitter. Thanks for listening.